You want to talk about Jaylen Johnson, cornerback from the Chicago Bears, and where he might end up today.
Yep. So this was, I'll be honest, a little bit of a surprise. He's obviously, made it pretty clear he's not happy with contract talk extensions going back a couple contract extension talks going back a couple days now, maybe over a week. But I thought they would find a way to get it done. He is obviously a top 5 graded corner for us this season. Has been exceptional. Had the huge splash game with the pick six, another interception. And he's 24 years old on a team that has $1 billion in cap space. And look, yes, they drafted Tyreek Stevenson and your guy Terrell Smith this past class. But it's kind of weird to me at this stage in the rebuild to continue to let good young talent go. Last year, I guess you could say it made sense with Roquan Smith. But anyway, where do I think Jaylen Johnson goes or wants to go? He's from California. I think he probably wants to be a San Francisco 49er if I had to guess. I know they're in the market for corners. They've been making some phone calls on corners across the NFL. Obviously have Travarius Ward. Not great play from Diameter Lenore the last couple of weeks, although I think he's been solid, frankly. But anyway, I think they're heavily in the mix for sure. I think Philadelphia is a team to monitor here. Buffalo, and lastly, Pittsburgh, I think, is probably in the mix too.
Wow. So a lot of kind of contender teams for him. What does the market look like for a guy like Jaylen Johnson? Because on the one hand, you've got, as you say, 24-year-old corner playing his best football, has previous really high-level play as well. Like his rookie season, I think he had 13 pass breakups, something like that. On the other hand, you've got, expiring contract and is about to want to get paid like one of the best corners in the NFL. So what does that do to the actual trade value, given what we've just been talking about of, contract equals draft capital?
Yeah, I do think that. So he's on a rookie deal. So from that standpoint, he's cheap. But I do imagine now that he's been granted the right to talk to other teams, the main point of that is so that he can try to work out an extension as a part of the trade to make this other team more comfortable bringing him in, and not potentially losing him after 10 games for a rental. I think with him, you're talking $17, $18 million a year. I don't think he's in that upper echelon of the 20-plus guys. I think he's above, that Carlton Davis, Jamel Dean type range in the 14.5, 15 area. So I think he's kind of in between those two markets. So from a value standpoint, because I think there are a ton of suitors here, and B, there's guys like a Dante Jackson, Christian Fulton, Tennessee, maybe, but I think Jaylen Johnson is by far leaps and bounds the best available cornerback at the deadline. So maybe that drives it up. I think best case scenario, absolute best case scenario, the Bears get a second. I think more realistically, maybe you get a 2/3, something of that nature. But yeah, absolutely a solid day 2 pick at the very least.
Given that you mentioned a list of teams, most of whom are like pretty solid contenders, are there any teams that are going to be interested in him just as a rental? Like, we know we're not going to get a long-term deal done with him. On the other hand, we expect to be playing deep into January and we want to be playing in February. We're okay with spending a draft pick for this to be a one-season rental.
Yeah, so it's a good point because we also talk a lot about, the compensatory pick thing and all that. So for Chicago, a comp pick for Jaylen Johnson is probably not very realistic because they have $110 million in projected cap space. They're going to spend a ton of it. For a contender like a San Fran or the teams I mentioned, Philadelphia, et-cetera, they are in the market for a comp pick. If they do let this guy walk, they're probably not going to make a splash signing. I guess San Fran added Javon Hargrave, but it's far more realistic they could. So, yeah, in theory, even if you give up a 2 and just say, hey, or if he stays healthy, we'll get a 3 in the offseason. We saw that a couple years ago from Philadelphia with Golden Tate. They send a 3, get a 4. That was part of their thought process the entire time.
Right.
I think it is a good point, no question. But still, there some risk is involved there, no question.
And that was part of the logic when the Rams brought in Von Miller, right? Like, we know that we're probably letting him go, and we've factored in a comp pick into this whole process, the trade to get him versus what we're going to get in comp pick. And we know it's a rental, but we're good with that.
Well, it certainly was one of the outcomes they were comfortable with. I think they really did want to keep him around, and Buffalo just dropped a massive contract offer at his feet. But yeah, no, it's always at least even if it's not your plan A, it is certainly, a plan B or whatever. And the Rams knew they weren't going to spend, after that season in free agency. They obviously did not add much talent, in free agency at all.
One of the other players that seems most likely to get moved before the deadline is Montez Sweat. So we've been talking a little bit already, a couple of times in the show, this dynamic that Washington has put themselves in. Montez Sweat, Chase Young, both playing well, both up for a contract renewal. You can only really keep one of them, and that means what Washington's best thing to do in terms of negotiation for the one you're keeping is get rid of the other one now. So is that actually going to happen, and where's he going to end up if it does?
I do. I think that is going to be the blockbuster that we get today. I think it is between the Atlanta Falcons and the Chicago Bears at this juncture. Maybe a team like San Francisco could be in the mix as well. But I think those two teams are vying pretty hard for his services right now. Also, maybe exploring the idea of an extension as part of the trade as well. But yeah, I think it's one of those two teams. Obviously, Chicago would be the biggest upgrade they could possibly make across their entire roster, frankly. And Atlanta as well. They're actually just as bad in pressure rate from edge rushers specifically as the Chicago Bears are. Both teams are bottom five in the NFL if you just filter to the edge rushers and their pass rush win rate. They're both, very, very low. So I think it's one of those two teams that gets it done. There's a ton of connections here. So Kyle Smith was a former personnel guy in Washington when they drafted Montez Sweat. He is now with the Atlanta Falcons. Mississippi State, Luke Getsy, the offensive coordinator in Chicago, was at Mississippi State with Montez Sweat. So there's familiarity there with both teams. It makes a total football sense for both teams. They also have, of course, ton of resources, draft picks, cheap rookie contract players. I think he will be a member of one of those teams in the next 4.5 hours.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was just pulling up the pressure rates for both teams. They were 1 and 2 for the bottom pressure rate last season. The Bears were by far and away the least capable team in the league at getting pressure on the opposing quarterback, and Atlanta was number 2, albeit much closer to the rest of the pack than the Bears were. The Chicago Bears are second worst this season. They've gone up one spot. They're marginally ahead of Carolina after the first bunch of weeks of the season. Atlanta, as you said, they've actually crawled, to mid-table respectability, but it's all basically because of David Onyemata on the inside. And they just lost Grady Jarrett, which isn't going to help. In terms of edge rush, they still don't really have pressure coming from anywhere. Bud Dupree, they're signing to try and make that happen. Obviously, our history on Bud Dupree commentary, that hasn't worked. Lorenzo Carter, Arnold Ebiketie, they're not doing anything. It's Calais Campbell, it's David Onyemata, it's Grady Jarrett on the inside, and now one of those three is down. So they absolutely still need an edge rusher, and the Bears just need anybody on the defensive line still.
Yeah, 100%. And I know it sounds weird for, Atlanta makes sense. They're probably heavily in the NFC South mix, or at least a wild card potentially. You could probably still quibble with, you're giving up a day 2 pick that you could maybe use to trade up for a quarterback, but whatever. With Chicago, I know it seems bizarre. And they did the same thing last year, and obviously it was a disaster where, you move a day 2 to get Claypool, gain a day 2 for Roquan Smith. I think this one makes a little bit more sense just because, as I mentioned, we got to see better play from these guys. But Terrell Smith and Tyreek Stevenson, Smith's been pretty good when he plays. You just drafted 2 corners. You also drafted Kyler Gordon, and you have nothing at edge rusher. And sure, they could say, we get one of the guys in free agency. I'm not sure a whole lot of free agents are lining up to sound the Chicago Bears right now. So I think if you want to get I think he's a high-end number 2 as opposed to a true number 1. But again, he's the best edge rusher the Bears have on the roster by 10 miles if they pull this off.
Yeah, it's one of those things where wherever you think he lands in the spectrum, and that's more relevant to sort of the contract that he's going to get signed to, he's clearly a good starting caliber defensive lineman, of which I don't know that Chicago has any right now. So from that point of view, it's absolutely a massive upgrade for them, and it's just a case of if you're happy enough with the kind of contract that you're going to need to pay him, but at some point you need to get some players onto that defensive line. We've been calling for this since last free agency, where instead they went and spent the money on linebackers and drafted some guys to take that spot. But they haven't made the impact yet. They may never make the impact. At some point, if you want to make any kind of moves on defense, you're going to need defensive linemen that can make something happen on their own.
For sure. And again, he's not quite the pass rush win rate, of a Chase Young in Washington, but also, remarkably durable. One of the best run defending edges, I think, in the entire NFL. And I'm fairly confident our grades back that up. And so I think for Chicago, it's a building block piece. And also, I don't expect a first-round pick to get moved here. I guess maybe if the two teams bid themselves up a ton, but there's no way Chicago would move probably 2 top 10 picks, and I don't think Atlanta does either. So I think you're giving up a second and something else potentially. Interesting thought if Washington, who could certainly use a corner, maybe is open to the idea of a swap there, but I don't know if that's any, that might be a dumb suggestion. But yeah, I get the arguments against it. I think if you're Chicago, you're saying there's a marquee 25-year-old who has an extremely high floor. I think it makes sense.
And elite high-end athleticism as well. I mean, that's one of the things that sometimes these guys don't have in their favor. When you're sort of looking at these guys that are good, not necessarily great. And one of the things that might be holding them back is, look, they have a level athletically, right? They're not sort of Chase Young or Myles Garrett in terms of insane bursts and athleticism and size. Like Montez Sweat is a freak athlete on top of all that as well. So potentially there is more to come from him. Like a team could talk themselves into the idea that there is still untapped potential in Montez Sweat even this deep into his career.
Also a perfect fit for this defense.
Right.
I mean, they probably thought about other guys like a Brian Burns or whatever, who I don't think is a particularly great fit for this particular defensive system. Granted, maybe it's not the same system next year, but I think Montez Sweat can have his hand in the dirt, could be an outside linebacker that stands up more often. But I think what Matt Eberflus wants in a defensive end is Montez Sweat.
Right. Okay, Brad, I'm going to turn the floor over to you. We've got a few minutes left. Anybody else you want to cover before we get out of here?
There's probably some smaller moves. I think Buffalo is trying to move off of Kyer Elam, which is, very quick turnaround for their first-round pick from last year. But I think they are open to the idea. Unfortunately, though, I think not unfortunately, but a lot of the teams that probably were going to be sellers won a bunch of games recently. Maybe a small move from Minnesota. I'd keep an eye on guard tackle Ezra Cleveland. Now that Dalton Risner is playing great football in that lineup, and obviously, Minnesota has difficult decisions to make. So, a couple smaller names there. I'm sure we'll get more. I personally can't speak to anything else, but hopefully we get some madness.
What kind of market do you think a guy like Kyer Elam would have? Because they immediately decided that guy's just not for them, right? He lost out to a 6th-round draft pick in his own draft class before the season had started, right? So we talked a lot about Tyreek Stevenson versus Terrell Smith, 2 guys in the same draft class, and I liked Smith better than Stevenson, and I was sort of saying, look, every year there's one of those guys, right, where somebody drafted lower down jumps the dude drafted above them and ends up being the better player or having the more significant role in the defense. Smith was my pick for that happening. They haven't gone that way, maybe judging by the play they should have, but they didn't. The point being, it takes quite a lot for you to say, no, the 6th-round pick is actually the guy that needs the playing time more than the 1st-round pick that we just made. And yet they did that almost immediately. And that secondary has been decimated by injuries. They have reason to play Kyer Elam all the time, and they do it as a last resort. And even when they do it, he plays like a different defense to everybody else. They go hey, Kyer, you go play man coverage, press man, don't worry about anything else. The rest of the defense will be doing something different. Don't worry about it. You just lock onto your guy. You take care of that. Does that can't go unnoticed by the rest of the league? They must be looking at that and going, I mean, we like this guy at draft time, but that's pretty rough.
It's interesting, right? So a couple thoughts there. I mean, respect to a phenomenal NFL player, but when Josh Norman at this stage is replacing you on the active, for an active game, that's about as bad of a sign you could possibly have. The man coverage thing is interesting because it's comical. Like you said, they're a heavy cover 3 and zone team. And so maybe another team that does play a lot of man, I mentioned Pittsburgh, maybe they are interested in, hey, we can use him differently and get him in a role that fits him. He's young, whatever. We also had, this is basically CJ Henderson again. And Carolina, I want to say give up a 3rd and a 6th, if I remember correctly. I'm not sure if they even get that, although I think it was after one season was C.J. Henderson. I guess we're basically a year and a half into Kyer Elam, but it's not going to be a lot. That is for sure. But I could see a team that plays a lot of man just saying, hey, look, let's just buy low, see what we have in him, and he'll be a better fit for us. But like you said, I mean, it's gone. I think Henderson even played for Jacksonville. He just wasn't playing well. Yeah. Elam's not even playing amidst a bunch of injuries.
Yeah. Okay, he hasn't been good when he's been playing, but he hasn't looked catastrophic either. I mean, that's the thing that's always been kind of interesting about it. It's an incredibly bad sign that basically from day one they've been we might have made a mistake here. Let's do anything we can to keep him off the field. But when he has played, Like, it hasn't been atrocious, particularly when they have, given him this sort of more friendly role towards his skill set. There have been players where they've been on the field and immediately you've been like, oh, this guy just stinks. Like, this is not going to work. You've made a mistake. He isn't in that category, and yet they're kind of treating him as if he is.